Message to all the titans of industry, the tech bros and finance folks who fly private and think Donald Trump's unrestrained fetish with retribution and revenge doesn't impact you, won't impact you over the next 3 years. Unfortunately, I fear you're about to be proven very wrong as he gins up a politically motivated criminal probe into Jerome Powell that former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says puts the United States of America on a path toward a banana republic. Breaking over the weekend, news that the Trump Justice Department has opened a criminal investigation into Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell over whether Powell lied to Congress about the scope of the renovations of the Fed's headquarters. It comes after nearly a year of Powell standing up to Donald Trump and asserting his independence and that of the Federal Reserve amid an all-out pressure campaign by Donald Trump to get Powell to cut interest rates, even if doing so could be devastating for the U.S. economy. Powell posted a video on the website of the Board of the Governors of the Federal Reserve calling out the Trump administration. Watch.
This unprecedented action should be seen in the broader context of the administration's threats and ongoing pressure. This new threat is not about my testimony last June or about the renovation of the Federal Reserve buildings. It is not about Congress's oversight role. The Fed, through testimony and other public disclosures, made every effort to keep Congress informed about the renovation project. Those are pretexts. The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. This is about whether the Fed will be able to continue to set interest rates based on evidence and economic conditions, or whether instead monetary policy will be directed by political pressure or intimidation. I have served at the Federal Reserve under 4 administrations, Republicans and Democrats alike. In every case, I have carried out my duties without political fear or favor. Public service sometimes requires standing firm in the face of threats. I will continue to do the job the Senate confirmed me to do, with integrity and a commitment to serving the American people.
This criminal investigation into Jerome Powell isn't just an alarming sign of Donald Trump's growing embrace of authoritarianism and authoritarian tactics. Former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warns on CNBC that it could also tank the American economy, sending us down the same path as countries like Argentina, Turkey, and Venezuela. Yellen saying this, quote, "It seems to me that the market should be more concerned." Her warning is echoed in a statement signed by every living former Fed chair from both Republican and Democratic administrations, as well as former Treasury secretaries, former heads of the Council of Economic Advisors, and National Economic Council members. They write this, quote, "This is how monetary policy is made in emerging markets with weak institutions, with highly negative consequences for inflation and the functioning of their economies more broadly. It has no place in the United States, whose greatest strength is the rule of law, which is the foundation of our economic success." But Donald Trump's attempt at using his favorite tool of retribution and revenge, the now very willing Justice Department, to crush the independence of the Federal Reserve, could maybe possibly be blocked by his own party. Senate Banking Committee member, Republican Senator Thom Tillis, issued a statement that reads, quote, "If there were any remaining doubt whether advisors within the Trump administration are actively pushing to end the independence of the Federal Reserve, there should now be none. It is now the independence and credibility of the Department of Justice that are in question. I will oppose the confirmation of any nominee for the Fed, including the upcoming Fed chair vacancy, until this legal matter is fully resolved." I guess we have one. That's where we start today. Democratic Congressman Dan Goldman of New York is here at the table. He's a member of both the Judiciary and Homeland Security committees. Legal analyst Christy Greenberg is here. She's a former criminal division deputy chief at SDNY. She's the host of the YouTube show Courtside. Also joining us, New York Times investigative reporter Mike Schmidt. Congressman, it used to be news when one Republican would defy Donald Trump. I remember when Bob Corker was the one. Then there were a few years where Mitt Romney was the one. And I guess more recently, Tillis on a couple of issues has been the one. But I think we all know here in year 10 of the Trump story that it takes more than one. What is your reaction to the lack of reaction from Republicans to this insanity about a trumped-up criminal investigation into Jerome Powell?
I was encouraged by Lisa Murkowski's comments, where she said if the Department of Justice is investigating the Fed, then the Congress needs to investigate the Department of Justice, which is, of course, exactly right. And so there are a couple senators which can make a difference. But once again, there are crickets from House Republicans. And the notion of using the criminal justice system as a political cudgel is now being normalized by these Republicans. But the impact and the damage is now escalating tremendously. It's now not just political enemies like Letitia James or Adam Schiff or James Comey. It is actual government officials, current government officials. Lisa Cook is one, now Jerome Powell. And the impact, I think, is really reflected in that statement from the former board chairs and members, where they emphasize the importance of the rule of law. Now, I've spoken to you many times about the rule of law. It is a somewhat vague concept to a lot of people. But when they say that the rule of law is the foundation for the economic success of this country, what they are meaning is that the notion that our laws are followed, are independent, and are neutrally arbitrated by judges is the basis for our economic system. It is the reason why the dollar is so strong. And if you are now going to have monetary policy driven by political considerations, all of that faith in the dollar just goes completely down, and it will tank our economy. But the broader issue, and this is what I just don't understand about House Republicans, is they see this. They're not dumb. They know what's going on. And just to continually bend the knee to someone who is escalating and increasing his extremism, his anti-constitutional actions, his attacks on the very foundations. We're so far past the point where they should have done anything. But now that you're willing to just stand by while he absolutely tanks the economy, if that's ultimately, if he had his way, it's just baffling to me.
Well, the Republican House members, it's interesting that you're still interested in them. I don't think they have to bend the knee. They live on their knees. But I think the fact that they can't exist without donors. I mean, what kind of message can Democrats deliver to Jamie Dimon and other people who put money into Republican campaigns?
Yeah, there are two things, right, that could motivate them. One is losing their election, which for many of the vulnerable frontliners looks like is going to happen if things continue this way. That still has not motivated them. The second thing is for donors and corporate America to stand up, not just to the House Republicans, but actually to Donald Trump. That happened in Trump 1.0. And it was part of the reason why things stayed more or less on the rails, especially economically.
But you had more normal people. You had Dina Powell, who had just come out of Goldman Sachs. You had Steve Mnuchin. I mean, there were people around that had credibility.
Right, but remember how he was attacking Jeff Bezos at that time, you know, because the Washington Post was actually holding him accountable.
Right.
Now, Jeff Bezos is giving him millions of dollars. All of the corporate titans recognize that it's a lot easier to give him a little bit of money and stay out of the crosshairs than it is to stand up to it.
I guess my question is, the rule of law, you talk about it like it's something that is to be protected. Do we still live in a country with the rule of law? Do we still have a Justice Department that believes in the rule of law?
We have many, many people in the Justice Department who believe in the rule of law. We have people at the top of the Justice Department who do not care about the rule of law.
And those people inside the department, the many, many of them who believe in the rule of law, if their bosses find out they believe in the rule of law over political cronyism, do they keep their jobs or lose their jobs?
Many have lost their jobs.
So how do we have a rule of law if we have a Justice Department where the many, many people inside of it, if their bosses find out they believe in it, get fired?
Ultimately, that's how it is degraded and eliminated. I don't think we're over the hill here, but we are on top of it. We are absolutely on top of it. We saw that the number 2 prosecutor in the Eastern District of Virginia now was removed for refusing to pursue the Comey investigation after it was dismissed. So we're right at the precipice here, and that's why my frustration continues to grow, even though you and I have had this conversation and you have zero faith in the House Republicans. I feel like at some point, and we will push our levers and we will do what we can, and I will ask the Federal Reserve to provide to Congress everything that they are providing to the Department of Justice, which they can do, even pursuant to a grand jury subpoena. They can just turn it over with congressional oversight. That's something that we should absolutely do, so that we are privy to what this investigation is about. That's very easy. And there are other mechanisms that I think, levers that we can pull. But it is for my colleagues in the Judiciary Committee, who are former prosecutors and lawyers, who understand the importance of the rule of law, who used to enforce the rule of law, to sit there silently and watch Donald Trump just completely obliterate the rule of law, which is going to have massive impacts far beyond Democratic politicians, is shameful and it's disgraceful. And at some point, I think the American people need to make that very clear to them, which will happen in November, but can happen, especially by donors, right now.